Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to Historic Santa Fe Foundation's first Salon of 2023. If you are not familiar with us, the Historic Santa Fe Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to preserving and protecting the cultural resources and diverse cultural heritage of Santa Fe and the surrounding area. Salon El Zaguán is the foundation's monthly lecture series on New Mexico's history and related contemporary issues. Before I introduce Gordon, I would like to invite you to several of our upcoming events. On February 9th at 3 p.m., Sally Hayden von Kanta and Marla Lipkin will give an artist talk on their exhibition, Chasing the Light. They will discuss their process as plein air painters, as well as their reflections on how light shapes our perception of New Mexican landscapes. The artist talk will take place in person at our gallery on Canyon Road. The talk is free and open to the public. On February 16th at 4 p.m. inside San Miguel Chapel, Frank Graziano, former J.D. MacArthur Professor of Hispanic Studies at Connecticut College and author of numerous books on religious cultures, will give a presentation on folk saints of Spanish America and the practices associated with them. The presentation is highly illustrated and includes photographs Frank took in Argentina, Bolivia, Mexico, Peru, and Texas. This event is a fundraiser for both Historic Santa Fe Foundation and San Miguel Chapel. Half of the proceeds will go to San Miguel Chapel for their preservation fund. Tickets are $15 for non-members and $10 for Historic Santa Fe members. That being said, we want to remove financial barriers that would prevent people from attending Frank's presentation, and we are offering accessible ticket pricing. If you would like to attend, please pay what you can or contact me to be put on the list. You can find out more about the aforementioned programs on historicsantafe.org. Today's program is brought to you by the New Mexico Humanities Council, which is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are grateful for their support in providing this program, and we hope that you will take their survey at the end. It helps them receive funding. Today, we are honored to have Gordon Bronitsky with us. Gordon is an anthropologist by training. However, for the past 25 years, he has acted as the founder and president of Indigenow, a nonprofit which works with Indigenous artists and performers, both traditional and contemporary, to bring their voices to the world. For over 30 years, Gordon has created unique cultural experiences, from intimate gatherings to multi-day festivals. Gordon also served as the executive producer for Origins, First Nations Festival, which brought Indigenous theater groups from the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia to London. The scope of Gordon's work is truly international, and you can learn more about it at indigenow.com. During Gordon's presentation, please type your questions in the chat box. We'll do audience Q&A at the end. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I will now hand you over to Gordon.
Well, I want to thank you and the Historic Santa Fe Foundation and the New Mexico Humanities Council for making this possible, because it enables me to continue delivering on a promise I made in 1989, which I'd like to talk about before I launch into this. I worked with Miguel Trujillo's family to research his story. I never met him, unfortunately, because he had had a stroke by the time I was doing the research. But the family asked me to give his eulogy at his funeral at the church at Isleta. And at that time, I promised his daughter, Josephine Wakanda, that I would take every chance I could get to talk about her father and what he did. And this really enables me to continue fulfilling the promise I made to her. And I thank you for that. With that, it's really, I think, unusual that one individual can be singled out for playing a decisive role in history. In the struggle for civil rights, of course, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks have earned an honored place. But another pioneer was Miguel H. Trujillo from Isleta Pueblo. For most Americans, Indians remain the backdrop to real American history. Indian heroes are the warriors of the past, like Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, Geronimo, Popeye. But Trujillo directly confronted bias and prejudice from Indians and non-Indians that discouraged Indian participation in the larger system. And he did this in the 20th century, not in the distant past. What he did ultimately was to fight for the right to make democracy work for everyone, using the legal system and making it work for all citizens while maintaining his Indian identity. And you can show the first slide here, I hope. Okay. Basically, in 1924, the United States government made citizens of all American Indians, although many of them had already been granted citizenship earlier due to treaty relations. But nonetheless, the state of New Mexico continued to deny the right to vote in state elections to all Indians living on reservations. Denial was based on the 1912 New Mexico State Constitution of 1912, which forbade suffrage to, quote, Indians not taxed, unquote. On August 3rd, 1948, 36 years later, a special three-judge federal court in Santa Fe ruled that New Mexico had discriminated against its Indians by restricting the vote on this basis. And the person most responsible for this decision was Miguel Trujillo and his Leta Indian living at Laguna Pueblo. To assess the impact of what happened and what it meant, it's necessary to look at the law, the times, and the man. People like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. gained recognition for their part in the civil rights struggle. Why hasn't Miguel Trujillo achieved equal stature? Why is he unknown? Let's start in 1948. In 1948, Miguel Trujillo was a Marine veteran of the Pacific Theater and a teacher at the Bureau of Indian Affairs Day School at Laguna Pueblo. And he was also a candidate for a master's degree at UNM. On June 14th of 1948, he attempted to register to vote in Los Lunas and was refused by the recorder of Valencia County under the Indians not taxed provision. Trujillo and his attorney, Felix Cohen, the author of the Federal Handbook of American Indian Law, who was then the attorney for Laguna Pueblo, asked the federal district court in New Mexico for an injunction restraining this recorder. There had been attempts before to register Indians to vote, but they were unsuccessful. There are stories of Navajo Indians attempting to register to vote in Gallup before World War II and simply being beaten up. So the question is, with these unsuccessful attempts, what made Trujillo decide to press the issue further? According to his daughter, Josephine Wakanda, Trujillo initiated legal action to bring equality to the Indian people. He was a member of the All Indian Pueblo Council, and he tried everything he could to get the council to unite on this issue. The council refused to unite on this issue, and Miguel decided to go ahead on his own. By way of background, Trujillo's life showed considerable drive and determination. His father died when he was quite young, so his mother was left alone to raise the children. Trujillo began attending school at the Albuquerque Indian School, which at that time had only 10 grades. As he continued in his education at the Indian School, he felt increasing pressure from family and friends to quit school and really work to support his family. But he felt an education was essential, and he continued to attend school. In this, he was strongly encouraged by Isis Harrington, who was a teacher at the Albuquerque Indian School, and he in fact graduated from the Indian School. Next slide, please. This is the church at Isleta, an early historic picture. After the Albuquerque Indian School, Trujillo went on to Haskell Institute in Lawrence, Kansas for more education. He supported himself by working in the Colorado beet fields every summer. And soon after that, he met Ruchanda Paisano of Laguna Pueblo, who was also attending Haskell Indian School, and they got married. Now, he then got a job teaching at the Bureau of Indian Affairs Day School at Laguna, mostly. And here, let's see the next photo, please. That's the church at Old Laguna with Mount Taylor in the background. But he continued to drive for education. He took classes at the University of New Mexico from Laguna. And now, with I-40 zipping us along, we don't realize how really difficult that was. There was no I-40. There was no, there was a road. It just wasn't a very good one. And there were no scholarships at the time. So he was commuting to Albuquerque while teaching and while supporting his wife, their children, and his elderly mother. Yet after about 15 years of dogged persistence, Trujillo finally received his bachelor's degree just in time for the outset of World War II. As did many other Indians, Trujillo enlisted in the Marines and ultimately became a staff sergeant. At the end of the war, he was honorably discharged and he returned to his family and his teaching position at Laguna, continuing to regularly commute to Albuquerque to earn his master's on the GI Bill. I haven't been able to prove it, but I think Miguel Trujillo may have been one of the very first American Indians to graduate from UNM. And it took a lot of work. So let's see pictures 4 and 5. That's Miguel with Josephine Wakanda during World War II. Next one. And that's Miguel with Josephine and with his wife's parents, I think. So he came back from World War II, went back to Laguna. Something had changed. What was it about the post-war situation in New Mexico that encouraged him and others to push for suffrage? As I've mentioned, previous attempts to register to vote were discouraging and unsuccessful. Some Indians, as I mentioned, were beaten. Other Indians withdrew from their attempts to register because of the pressure that they received. So they were afraid of reprisal. And you have to remember, in a state where the majority party, which was the Republicans, held power by an 8,000 vote margin, not everyone favored the enfranchisement of about 20,000 Indian voters. Nonetheless, times had begun to change. In 1947, the report of the President's Committee on Civil Rights was published, and this report condemned disenfranchisement of Indians in New Mexico and Arizona, which also didn't allow Indians to vote until 1948. And this report noted that Indians were citizens and subject to federal and state taxes, except for lands and trust status, and the committee recommended that the New Mexico and Arizona grant suffrage to their Indian citizens. And attempts by Indians to gain voting rights also attracted great public support, as it did for Mexican Americans and African Americans who came back from World War II and faced incredible difficulties in voting. For instance, many people noted that the plaintiffs, Miguel Trujillo and the plaintiffs in Arizona, were veterans who had served in World War II. And ultimately, when the case was decided, in Trujillo's case, the presiding judge declared, and I quote, "It is perhaps not entirely pertinent to the question here, but we know how those New Mexico Indians have responded to the need of the country in time of war in a patriotic, wholehearted way, both in furnishing manpower to the military forces and the purchase of war bonds and patriotic contributions of that character. Why should they be deprived of their rights to vote now because they're favored by the federal government in exempting lands from taxation?" Unquote. Other pressures were also being brought to bear. Among other things, the federal government threatened to withdraw funds from states that denied Social Security to Indians. And at the same time, the Cold War was heating up, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for the United States to condemn communist regimes for mistreatment of their citizens, while American citizens were denied equality on the basis of race and color. And this Cold War argument came up in many other places. It came up with Mexican Americans in Texas. It came up with African Americans in the South. How can we condemn communists for mistreating their minorities when we are mistreating our own? The next picture, please. Before we go further, I would like to talk a moment about his attorney, who was Felix Cohen. Felix Cohen was the pioneer of federal Indian law. In 1939, he became the chief of the Indian Law Service, which was an attempted to compile all the federal laws and treaties regarding American Indians. And in 1941, it was published as the Handbook of Federal Indian Law. It was much more than a survey. And in fact, the handbook was the first to show how hundreds of years of treaties, statutes, decisions formed a comprehensive whole. And as a result, Felix Cohen is today credited with creating the modern field of federal Indian law. Even today, there have been several later versions of it, several reissues, and it is still a standard text which was originally published by the Department of Interior. The most recent reissue was just in 2005. He left federal service in 1947 as policy shifted from support for tribal governments to a policy of terminating tribal sovereign status. He entered private practice. He taught legal philosophy at Yale, at the City College of New York, and at Rutgers. And while in private practice, Cohen litigated Indian land claims and won the right for voting for American Indians in New Mexico and Arizona, and successfully challenged Arizona's practice of denying Social Security to Indians. So it was really quite something. He was a major figure. So Miguel and his attorney, Felix Cohen, took this decision to the appellate court. In this case, a 3-judge court was appointed to rule on the injunction requested by Trujillo and Felix Cohen. They argued that the constitutional provision excluding Indians not taxed violated the 14th and 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which stated that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It was the 14th Amendment, 15th, continue to have major effects today. As a part of their case, Trujillo and Felix Cohen noted that Trujillo and other Indians paid a variety of taxes. They were taxed. They paid income tax. They paid sales tax. All taxes that everyone else paid, except for taxes on tribal lands, which were held in trust by the federal government, technically. The Felix in particular argued that denial of the vote to Indians violated this equal protection of the clause because New Mexico permitted untaxed Black and white citizens to vote. And they noted that other citizens who did not pay taxes on land, for instance, people who lived in apartments, were allowed to vote, and that this was in fact simply discriminatory. So ultimately, this policy of declaring Indians not taxed was declared obsolete on precisely the grounds that they did pay taxes. And on the basis of this decision in 1948, New Mexico's Indians were counted in the congressional appointment, which ultimately resulted in an extra representative for the state. So on August 3rd, the presiding judge of the appellate court delivered the decision for the panel, quote, "The court ruled that those portions of the New Mexico Constitution that denied the right to vote to Indians were unconstitutional and void, and that the plaintiff and all citizens of Indian blood had the right to be registered," unquote. After 36 years of statehood, New Mexico was forced to grant its Indian citizens voting rights in state and local elections. The decision was widely publicized and quite favorably. There was attention from newspapers all over the country. The Secretary of the Interior, the National Congress of American Indians, all noted this and indicated it was a major decision. Trujillo continued to teach at the Indian school at Laguna and raise his family. And indeed, he later received an award from the Department of the Interior for his unselfish devotion to public service and exceptional interest in the advancement of Indian people, and ultimately was given an award of appreciation by the people of Laguna. But something happened. The name of Miguel Trujillo faded away. And there are very few people today who recall him or what he did. Elsewhere in the United States, the movement for equality and justice for all citizens gained momentum, often against considerable violence, but it changed forever the course of the country. Individuals like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. gained recognition for their part in this struggle. So why hasn't Miguel Trujillo received equal stature? Perhaps, as his daughter Josephine Wakanda once said, his time came late. The late 1940s and 1950s saw a major push for relocation of Indians away from reservation lands and a major push for the termination of federal trust status to tribes, which really crippled Indian communities and nations across the country. And this was all done in an attempt to bring them into the mainstream. So in this sense, Trujillo's defense of Indians and Indianness at the meetings of the All Indian Pueblo Council and his continuing insistence on registering people to vote ultimately led to pressure from the superiors in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And ultimately, the Bureau of Indian Affairs threatened to transfer him to an Indian school in South Dakota. Now, keep in mind, by this time, Miguel is supporting his wife, 2 children, and his elderly mother, who was in very poor health. And obviously, moving her to North Dakota wouldn't have helped. So, fearing the consequences of such a move to North Dakota, Trujillo really compromised his outspoken defense of Indians. And as a result, the family was transferred to the Intermountain Boarding School in Brigham City, Utah, where he remained until he retired in 1959. So away from New Mexico, he was away from his community at Laguna and Isleta. He was away from the All Indian Pueblo Council. But he continued to push for an education. He took courses for a doctorate at the University of California at Berkeley, having gotten his master's degree and his bachelor's degree from UNM. But unfortunately, again, the responsibilities of family, his job, and his distance from Berkeley prevented him from ever attaining that degree. But he just kept fighting. It was quite something. After retiring from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, he returned to Laguna. He continued to work for Indians through the National Indian Council on Aging, the Social Welfare Organization of New Mexico, and the New Mexico Adult Education Association. Although, as Josephine Wakanda said, his time may have come late, trying to promote suffrage in the face of many, many obstacles, gaining an education at great personal sacrifice, always fighting to get things done, as his daughter said. Trujillo's example is one that deserves to be remembered. And I'll just be honest, I think it's a disgrace that there has never been an exhibit about Miguel Trujillo. Really, there was a small one at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. There's never been one at the New Mexico History Museum. There's never been one at the Museum of Arts and Culture. And to be really quite frank, at Miguel's funeral, when I made the promise I did to Josephine, I told her just straight, if Miguel had made pottery or if he had made rugs, there would have been an exhibit about him 20 years ago. But all he wanted to do, quote unquote, was to vote and to get other Indians the right to vote. Now we take it for granted. We had our first congressional representative, Deb Haaland, who's now the Secretary of Interior. We have a very strong and active American Indian caucus in the State House and the State Senate. But they all know, or many of them, certainly Deb Haaland, who's from the same village Miguel was from, has openly recognized that she got where she is because Miguel Trujillo fought. And that's something ultimately to consider too. New Mexico has a public image of three different races, Hispanic, Native American, and Anglo, living together in peace and harmony, and it's simply not true. Those of you who are listening to this from Santa Fe just simply have to remember the struggle about the obelisk in the Santa Fe Plaza. That was not a peaceful protest. And when Indians were arrested for trying to interrupt the parade in association with the Reconquest, there was that. Navajos being beaten for attempting to register to vote before World War II, border town racism. There's a wonderful book called The Broken Circle about that. Or the situation in Gallup, which led to Larry Casus and Robert Nakaidanet taking captive the mayor of Gallup, who was notorious for a bar that served primarily Indians and couldn't be closed down. And ultimately, Larry Casus was shot dead by the police. Or the Goras Blancas in northern New Mexico, the white caps who fought, frankly, the state and the federal government when they were taking away land grant common lands. Or we can look at other issues of great conflict, slavery in New Mexico. There's a wonderful book called The Other Slavery. New Mexico was a slave state, not in the sense of African-American slaves, but Indian slaves, in which Hispanics were major slavers, but so were the Comanches. So what I'm suggesting to you is that we start to move beyond this peaceful, happy, tie-dye image of everyone living in brotherly harmony and singing Kumbaya for all that I know, and to realize that we have made progress, but we made progress because people fought for it. And again, I would simply again like to thank Miguel Trujillo's family for sharing this with me, and I would like to acknowledge my ongoing debt and appreciation to his daughter, Josephine Wakanda. So I think that should leave plenty of time for questions. I would encourage all of you to post them in the chat if you haven't already, and to think about what I'm saying. Friends, right now, if I can, in fact, just a little more parenthesis about voting. I want to look at very briefly Arizona and Utah. If you're familiar with the county map of Arizona, Navajo Nation is covered by two long, thin rectangular counties, Navajo and Apache County, and their county seats, Winslow and St. John's, are the furthest south. Why do those counties look like that? Why do they have that odd shape? When the counties were created in Arizona, they were created that way to create white majorities on the Navajo reservation and Western Apache. So in Navajo and Apache counties, the majority of people there are white, even though it includes the nation's largest reservation. Or we can look at San Juan County in Utah, which is the Navajo, the Utah portion of the Navajo Nation. Navajo finally gained representation on the city count, on the county commission. I think about 4 or 5 years ago, the city of Bluff, which is the county seat, threatened to secede from San Juan County because they didn't want to be governed by Indians. It was that simple. So a little note, and now ask away, ask your questions. I'm ready. I hope. Don't tell me there aren't any questions. I couldn't. That would be certainly a surprise. Okay. Because I can certainly talk about more conflicts if you want. I was talking with her about some of them before we began. I can always talk about burning the Kachina masks at Laguna. But let's see if there's any questions first.
Yeah. No questions yet.
Total enlightenment. Well, while we're waiting for questions, let me enlarge on what I was talking with you about earlier, because I think it's worth knowing. One of the difficulties that is often not acknowledged is the struggle for Native American religious freedom. And it takes a lot of different forms. For instance, at Laguna Pueblo, after the Civil War, Indian reservations were under the auspices of the War Department. And it was so notoriously corrupt that Indians starved to death. And as a result, many reservations were put under the auspices of different religious denominations. That's why I tell my friends, technically, Geronimo died a Dutch Reformed Indian because the Dutch Reformed Church had jurisdiction over the reservation in Oklahoma where he was. And in New Mexico, one of the major Christian churches that did that was the Presbyterians, who had missionaries at several pueblos, but the only pueblo where Presbyterianism ever took hold was Laguna, where probably as many as a third or fourth of the people converted to Presbyterianism. And Laguna is one of the few pueblos that has real open elections rather than appointment by traditional religious leaders. In 1885, Miguel Saraceno was elected governor of Laguna. He was the first Presbyterian Laguna to be elected as governor. One of the things he did, he gathered the Kachina masks of the Laguna people in the plaza at Old Laguna and had them publicly burned. As you might imagine, this horrified traditional Lagunas, and a lot of the traditional Lagunas left Laguna and moved to Isleta, where they established a community they called Oraibi. And they stayed there, I think, until the 1920s or 30s. I've never been able to find out when they moved. But they returned to Laguna and established the community of Mesita, which, if you're ever heading west on I-40, Mesita is the first Laguna village that you encounter. And it's also the one that Deb Holland is from. On a slightly different side, though, we can move to 1954, when Isleta Pueblo got a new priest from Germany. And he was new, and he didn't know the modus vivendi that governed Pueblo Indians, where Pueblo Indians were definitely Catholic, but the native religion continued to be, as one of them told me, the heart of their people.
Yeah. We have a couple questions now, Gordon.
Okay. Should I finish, or you'll go to the questions?
You want to finish yours and then we'll
Okay,
get
it's
to
quick.
that.
Basically, Stadtmuller told the people at his letter to stop all that dancing and carrying on. They said it's none of his business. He continued, and ultimately Andy Abeyta, who was governor in 1954, got a court order forbidding Stadtmuller from going on the reservation and escorted him off the reservation in handcuffs. And with that note, let's go to the questions. Let me know. What are the questions?
So the first one is, please say more about the current strong Indian caucus.
Well, I don't know. I can't remember at this point how many Indian representatives there are in the House, in the New Mexico State House. Most of them are Navajo, except for the Magdalenas, who are from Jemez, who seem to have a lock on the Pueblo representation in the House. I'm giving a talk at Jemez Springs Library next month about this, and I'm really hoping that some of them will come and we can talk about that. And certainly Senator Pino, who just died, I think last year or 2 years ago, was a Navajo senator who's there a long time, and they have been fairly strong. I'm not enough of a politician to give details on that one, unfortunately, but certainly names like Magdalena and Pino, and there are others as well, have been quite influential in New Mexico politics. Another question.
Okay. What can be done to get Miguel's story the recognition it deserves?
Oh, God. Whoever asked that, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I think one of the things to do, and I've been trying this, is just to start calling. For instance, the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture. Yes, it's Indian art and culture, but I think voting is part of that. What would happen if somebody simply called them? I mean, said, I'd like to speak to the person in charge of programs or the person in charge of the museum. And, very politely, you don't want to be negative, but said, I think it would be wonderful if the museum was to have an exhibit or something about Miguel Trujillo, or if they were called the New Mexico History Museum. Because one of the things that is, for me, frankly, really frustrating is how much there is. For instance, I know that Miguel's family still has his Marine uniform. And when I was looking at his stuff with Josephine, I got a real surprise. Miguel Trujillo was a prolific amateur photographer, taking pictures, especially when he was at the Indian school. And he labeled all those photos. The one that I remember most, there was a photo of Indians in a canoe on the lawn at the Indian school. I assume they were doing something with Hiawatha. On the back were the names of everybody in the canoe. So in other words, there are very significant, meaningful resources. I donated my papers to the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. I had, among other things, a carbon copy, whoever knows what those are anymore, but a carbon copy of the appellate court decision that Josephine had given me. I gave that to the Pueblo Cultural Center. I gave my reading copy of his eulogy. So there are materials there. There's much less known about attempts to register before World War II. But I saw a reference to the Gallup paper, which covered something, I think in 1938, when somebody was beaten. So what I am saying is there is information. There are materials for an exhibit, for a talk, for programs for children. And what we all, or you can call or talk to your representative or talk to your congressional representative. That's what I've been doing. And, I think that frankly, the more of us that call politely and say, I think it would be really good to do this. Miguel Trujillo and Native voters, it took 36 years. Well, he died in 1989. My math is terrible, but we still have a few years before it's 36 years from when he died. So that's what I would recommend. Talk to anybody you can and say, nicely, I think the time has come for an exhibit about Miguel Trujillo, and maybe do it with his letter, do it with Laguna, whatever, but keep pushing. He did, I am, you should. Next question.
Since the work of Miguel on voting rights was focused in New Mexico, I was curious how these ramifications affected voting rights for Indigenous peoples throughout the nation on the federal level.
Well, that's a little different story. 1924, the United States enacted legislation that gave citizenship to American Indians all over the United States with the right to vote in federal elections. And probably as many as 2/3 of all Indians were already citizens because they had gotten it through, usually through treaty situation. For instance, that one of the Potawatomi bands is the Citizens Band of Potawatomi because they took citizenship. There were some Indians who refused government citizenship because they said they weren't US citizens, they were citizens of their native nation. And that was certainly true for the Iroquois Confederacy in upstate New York, where, just to show you how that played, I toured a group of Iroquois artists from Canada to Germany for something they were doing. And I said, don't forget your passports. And they said, which ones? We've got Canada, US, and Iroquois passports. So to answer your question directly, by 1948, only Arizona and New Mexico did not allow Indians to vote in state elections. And the major legislation had really come in 1924 at the federal level. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, and the last one, how do you think that education and voting rights were interrelated for Miguel?
That's a very good question. I don't know if I've ever been asked that. I don't know if how interrelated they were. I mean, he had obviously begun pushing hard for an education when he was still at the Albuquerque Indian School. So that just continued to be a major focus of his life, getting a bachelor's and a master's from UNM when there was no support for Native students at all, not even an Indian club, which wasn't started till the 50s. And his voting, I really believe from talking to particularly Josephine, that like many other returning veterans, Mexican-American, African-American, he came back and said, I fought for freedom. I fought for democracy. I was a Marine. I wasn't a social worker. And I come back and I can't vote. Although what Josephine told me, which I thought was especially interesting, when he attempted to register to vote in 48, the registrar who refused to allow him to vote was actually a friend of his. There's an intertwining for you. So I don't know if they intertwined, but they were both expressions, I think, of his real dedication and drive for suffrage and for education. He certainly continued to push for education, which has shown up with his children and now his grandchildren. He was a hero. I just think more people should know about him. Other questions?
That's it, Gordon.
Well, I know we're supposed to go till 3, but I'm open for suggestions. Usually I get more questions, which is why
We have another one. Who was his other child? Please say more about Josephine also.
Well, okay. Miguel had 2 children, Mike Trujillo, who actually retired. He lives in Albuquerque. I haven't seen him in 20 years. Who became, I can't remember if it was the chief dentist for the Indian Health. I think it was the head dentist for the Indian Health Service, and he lived in South Dakota for a while. Josephine also was an educator and did a great deal. And so, what would be really good is for those people who really would like to see an exhibit, is to know that Mike is still here. Josephine is not. Josephine's children are here, and they have his materials. They know some of what he did, what I've found out, what they learned from other things. So I think that his children, both Josephine and Mike, should be mentioned, and that Mike probably would still be a very valuable resource. Although most I've dealt with Josephine and with her children, particularly with John Wakanda, and to a lesser extent with his sister Tirzah. And they live here, they're alive. Talk to them, get them to do it. That's the wrong approach. They want to do it. We have talked about this, God knows. So I think what we all need to do is to really follow Miguel's lead and push.
That's great, Gordon. Thank you. We do have a survey for everybody to take after this is over, so I think it's okay if we wrap up a little bit early.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, thanks everybody for being here. Oh wait, let's see, there's one more. Oh, what is the relationship between land and voting rights?
Boy, these are good questions.
Yeah.
Land and voting rights are in some senses separate. It perhaps might be helpful to think of American Indians as dual nationals. They are US citizens, they are tribal citizens. And as such, tribal sovereignty applies a great deal. Voting issues were particularly complicated, I think, among Pueblo Indians. And I know that I led a voter registration drive with Herman Agoyo, who was then with the All Indian Pueblo Council in the 80s. And we spoke to a meeting of Pueblo governors, and several people there, who I won't mention their names, said that it would be difficult because for a long time, Pueblo leadership was concerned about voting simply because most Pueblo officials are appointed by traditional religious leaders. They're not elected in that sense, except Isleta, Zuni, Laguna, and I think Nambe, although I could be wrong. And they were concerned about essentially having their people vote for state officers or whatever when they didn't vote for their own tribal officials. So that was probably one of, but now that has long gone. You know, certainly thanks to Roger Magdalena and so on, and certainly for the push for registration among Navajos. It's no secret, for instance, that in the last election, when Arizona enacted a number of laws to purify voting, I'm not going to even go there, but what they did, for instance, one example is that you couldn't harvest ballots, which meant you couldn't tell people, you know, I'll take your votes, your sealed ballots and drop them off at the voter registration place or wherever they were supposed to. And that was widely interpreted, certainly in the Navajo Nation, as an effort to restrict Navajo voting, where most people don't have cars, live in those isolated areas. And it was the custom for somebody in let's say Hard Rock or these other little towns, little cities, little wide places on the road to say to their friends and relatives, well, I'm going into town, I'll give me your vote, your ballots, and I'll drop them off. So that was an attempt, again, because everyone knows that the Navajo Nation votes heavily Democratic, heavily, like 95% Democratic. So that was an attempt by officials in Arizona to restrict that. So that's the relationship. Oh, I see one. Tell us another story, please. Well, I would love to. And in fact, what I'll do is I'll prejudice this whole thing by saying, I would love to talk about a man named Solomon Bebo. This is my cue for her to say, oh, we should invite Gordon back. But okay, Solomon Bebo was a Jewish immigrant from Germany who became governor at Acoma Pueblo in 1885, the only white person, the only non-Indian ever to serve as official leader of an Indian tribe in the United States. There, I'll leave you with that. I'm not going to tell you anymore because I would love to talk about it. And I did the research on that too. No, that was an experience. So I thank Lucinda de Lorimier for that. I would be delighted to come back and speak. My friends would probably tell you, it's not hard to get him to speak. It's hard to get him to shut up, but that's a whole nother issue. But again, I would like to thank all of you for listening and attending, and I would very much like to thank the Historic Santa Fe Foundation for enabling me to do this. Hey, Josephine, I'm still doing it, still here. Thank you very, very much.